To discuss that and lots more, we have K. Ramakrishnan. He's the MD South Asia, the Worldpanel Division at Kantar. Thank you so much for taking time out and joining in. To begin with, Mr. Ramakrishnan, what have you observed in these times of the pandemic by way of consumer behavior? Do you think that we are gradually seeing things now come back to normalcy? Are consumers actually ready to go back to those pre-COVID levels and loosen their purse strings?
I think the pandemic itself seems like a very long time because it started early March and we are going on till now. There have been phases of intense lockdown to lesser lockdown and unlock and so on and so forth. So what we have observed during the pandemic phase is that there has been a change in behavior almost on a fortnightly basis, depending upon the extent of opening up or the extent of closure. So if you notice in the early parts of the pandemic, we saw a lot of buying on account of panic or a fear of lack of availability. And at that time, what we were observing was that the staples seemed to score a lot, in the sense the percentage growth over the same quarter the previous year was very high for staples. People were stocking up on rice, wheat, edible oils, and so on and so forth. So as a result of that, there were at least 2 or 3 categories which saw an intense dip during the first phase of the pandemic. When I say first phase, please count it as March, April, May, June. So in that phase, if you notice, that would have been the ideal season for bottled soft drinks and all of those. Now, those suffered a serious setback, particularly when it comes to the in-home consumption of those categories. So they suffered. The second category or set of categories that suffered is what I would call as personal grooming. Personal grooming took a serious setback. I think because of the intense lockdown, a whole lot of people staying inside of homes, grooming took a setback. But as we moved from the June phase onward, July, August, September, we are seeing in the July, August, September, the growth in household purchases of FMCG is perhaps the highest in the past 12 quarters. I mean, if we saw an increase of 4.9%. That is, I'm talking about July, August, September 2020 versus July, August, September 2019. The growth was 4.9%. This 4.9% on an all-India basis of growth in FMCG household purchases is highest in the last 12 quarters. Now, this growth has come both in urban as well as rural. Even in urban India, it's been the highest quarter of growth. In rural, while it's not been the highest quarter of growth, the growth has been fairly significant. This is particularly noteworthy because rural saw a dip in the previous year, but they slowly came back in the course of this year. And in the second half of pandemic, they've had a pronounced growth. So those are the highlights that I would like to call out. One, the drop in grooming categories, which came back in July, August, September. Then the sharp drop in bottled soft drinks, etc., which also came back in the next quarter. But the growth, while the growth is pretty good in July, August, September, the key season, which is the summer season, is something that the category has definitely lost. Staples grew very well in the quarter one, in the first half of the pandemic. That growth has tapered down a little bit. What is definitely holding on is snacking, like things like, let's say, biscuits, noodles, pastas. These are categories which are distinctly holding on. Certainly personal hygiene, like let's say sanitizers or hand wash and things like that. And home care, which is to do with toilet care, toilet cleaning and household cleaning and things like that. Those are categories that are holding on. These are some of the trends that we're able to see as far as the consumer behavior of purchases during the pandemic.
Enough. So you're definitely categorizing it over the first few months and how things have really shaped up over the next half. So what's the timeline that you have in terms of when you see things really returning back to normalcy, the spending trends resuming the way they actually were, any particular observations within different categories that have seen stronger growth, as you already spoke about it, but if you could just elaborate a little bit more on that, Mr. Ramakrishnan?
Certainly. Actually, when it comes to FMCG, from a household purchase lens, it did not perhaps go through any crisis phase at all. From a company's billing or primary sales perspective, there may have been differences, there may have been drops, but that is more to do with their ability to manage the logistics, which is to manufacture and connect. That could have led to some levels of disturbances and discrepancies during the first half of the pandemic. But when it comes to consumer behavior, consumer purchases and usage, etc., it's been more or less, I wouldn't say there was any kind of crisis during the pandemic phase. Yes, there have been categories which have suffered, which is like personal grooming. I mean, personal grooming, particularly if you talk about things like, let's say, hair colorants or deodorant, these are categories which suffered, but they're also showing some signs of a comeback. Staples, which in the first half was overstocked on account of the fear of unavailability, etc., is kind of slowing down in terms of growth, still growing, but slowing down in terms of growth. The snacking and others, like one of the big reasons why snacking is growing is, I would say, the lack of opening of schools and colleges. Now, in the first quarter, also that was true. But what happens is the first quarter, when we're talking about April, May, June, that phase we are talking about the summer when schools are typically closed. So therefore, last year also kids were at home. This year also kids were at home. So therefore, there was no change in terms of their availability. But if you take the July, August, September period, when kids would have typically gone back to school, etc., that has not happened this year, as a result of which kids being available at home means in-house consumption of snacking, etc., has been distinctly higher than the previous quarters. So I do not know how to explain to say, are we going back to the previous times, because FMCG has always been more or less the same. There are minor disturbances in terms of stocking up on staples, etc., which have come back to normal. And grooming, etc., went down, which has also come back to normal. Now, if you take categories like personal hygiene, like sanitizers, etc., this year saw a growth which was unprecedented. Very clearly, you and I and everybody that we know of is always using sanitizers multiple times in a day. Just to throw some number at you, in 2019, the annual penetration of sanitizers was 1.5%, which is, if there were 100 households, only 1.5 households bought a sanitizer in the entire year 2019. Today, we're talking about a monthly penetration of 31%. So you can do the math in terms of the multiplication, in terms of the numbers. That said, the growth in sanitizers continued even during the July, August, September quarter. In early October data and November data, we have not completed or closed the data, but we are noticing that there may be a slight drop in terms of the number of households buying sanitizers, either on account of having bought excess and holding on to them. But as things open up, definitely the usage of sanitizers will only go up, even though there has been a temporary drop that we see in October. But otherwise, FMCG has been a normal story right through the pandemic, and we've not seen anything to say that are we back to normal, etc.
Sure. I also wanted to understand, Mr. Ramakrishnan, given that rural has been leading the recovery from the start of the pandemic, how's the acceptance of digital services though? Because more and more you're seeing companies also, increase their digital presence. And if there are two trends which have emerged winner, that's A, rural recovery, and B, digital. But how are the two merging themselves together?
Yeah, so I think certainly digital has helped in terms of the delivery of consumption itself, in the sense that the order processing, the process by which someone is able to reach out to smaller outlets, which in turn service rural area, etc. From a distribution back-end perspective, there's been quite a lot of usage of digital. But if you're looking at it from the digital media and its penetration, etc., I think there's not been something that is substantially different at this phase as compared to the previous quarters. Yes, on account of the fact that people have been at home in urban India, the consumption of OTT, etc., has been significantly higher. But while factories and offices closed, the farms did not, because even during the peak of the pandemic, there was work happening in farms, etc. The growth in rural is coming on account of 2 or 3 factors. One, the fundamentals are better this year. One is it's a fantastic monsoon this year. Second, the harvest of wheat is expectedly the best this year in the past 3 years, etc. Third, good minimum support pricing. All of these factors put together contributed significantly to growth of rural. There was also a minor contribution in terms of some level of reverse migration, which happened, as a result of which also rural consumption went up. Actually, in terms of rural consumption, the first half of the pandemic was not that great on account of the fact that producers, manufacturers, brand owners could not connect their wares to rurals well in time on account of transportation disturbances and discrepancies. But as time went by, all the positive factors in terms of fundamentals are in favor of rural, as a result of which rural consumption saw a sharp increase in the time to go by. But like I said, rural has seen bigger growths, and rural is more volatile than urban. So it has seen growths which are bigger than this. While for urban, this is the best quarter ever, July, August, September, in terms of purchases. For rural, it's not. There have been higher quarters than this. That said, it is still a very, very high quarter for growth, even for rural in July, August, and September.
What about product availability and competitive pricing? And that clearly seems more important than the brand name of late. How have things normalized over here? And do you see this trend changing, consumers moving back to their preferred brand? Or do you sense that price consciousness is something that's going to take some time to go?
Actually speaking, if you track brand data over multiple parts of history, we've always seen that when in doubt, go to the most trustworthy person. To that extent, whenever there's a crisis, the bigger brands tend to win more because of trust, more because of safety, and because people do not want to take chances in times of crisis. So to that extent, even during the pandemic, we've noticed that the big brands have really been more successful. If they have not been impacted by supply discrepancies, definitely they have certainly played a bigger role in terms of gaining market share during this period of time. So to that extent, a crisis is actually good for big brands. So that is as far as a brand and its sensitivity and loyalty perspective. But if you look at price, what is more important to see is in terms of accessible pricing more than price per se, which is to say, are there packs which are amenable to me at this point of time? In the early parts of the pandemic, if in categories like staples, we saw that people were buying large packs and stocking up. So that time, the low unit packs was not really something that was making such a big difference. But as time went by, the low unit packs came back, and we are now back to using, as like, for example, in sachets, in shampoos, sachets are ruling the roost and they continue to rule the roost. So similarly, if you talk about even categories like detergents, the 10 rupee packs of washing powders, that seems to be the sweet spot, and that's hitting the consumers in terms of adding new households as well as increasing consumption. So to that extent, the importance of those key price points, which is the low unit pricing, etc., is going to be extremely important. But that said, branding is not going away in a hurry at all.
Okay, great to have you, Mr. Ramakrishnan, on the show. Thank you so much for taking the time out and joining in with all your insights.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.